By the time he graduated from college, John Smith had forgotten all about the bad fall he took on the ice that January day in 1953. In fact, he would have been hard put to remember it by the time he graduated from grammar school, and his mother and father never knew about it at all. The Dead Zone was published in 1979 after a collection of short stories titled Night Shift and the first edited version of The Stand. I am skipping them both right now because I want to select which stories of Night Shift I will talk about, and The Stand is kinda really long, and I need to decide what to focus on, and let's be honest, we are not in the mood to read about how the whole world ends thanks to a pandemic that is not correctly contained, right? Although there's a mini based on it coming on December, so maybe we are in the mood for it, and I do not understand trends. In any case, let's talk about The Dead Zone. Now, I had three choices for how to tackle this novel, because it's also the most overtly political of all King's novels, and the main bad guy is a Republican candidate for the Senate that, if elected, would end up as president of the USA and then the world. Yes. But after the last weeks, I figure we also need a rest from that subject. The other possibility, which also involves the second adaptation of the novel, a TV series starring Anthony Michael Hall, was a bit too close to my general thesis of the King universe, and I'm not sure of how many of you guys have seen the TV series or the David Cronenberg directed movie starring Christopher Walken, so that was also out. Instead, I decided that we were going to talk about a subject that was floating around in my last three videos, the mothers on King's books. While that is also subject in my general thesis, since there's no Stephen King novel in which the main characters' mothers, or their own motherhood, is not important in one way or another, and thus a specific kind of mother is part of what I consider the major arcana tarot of Stephen King. It's a little bit different because in The Dead Zone we can see three very different mothers, which in their own way give a good prologue to that idea, and are a perfect evolution of the mother character from the fearsome Margaret White to the more loving Wendy Torrance and beyond. I'm Adalisa Zarate, and today we're going to explore the dark side of the human brain as we explore Stephen King's The Dead Zone. The Dead Zone is the first novel by King that deals a bit with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, even if it's in a roundabout way. Basically, the premise is, what do you need to do to make Oswald the hero of the story? And a big part of the book is about John Smith trying to convince himself that his role in the plot is to kill a politician. But that's not all what the story is about, and in a lot of ways, that is the least interesting part of it all. So let's start at the beginning. What is The Dead Zone about? John Smith, an English teacher in the late 70s, is involved in a terrible car accident that leaves him in a coma for 4 years. When he wakes up, he finds himself a bit of a celebrity due to his recovery and the fact that he seems to have a new power. When he touches someone, he can tell their future or their past. This, unfortunately, makes him a bit of a pariah as people are not comfortable with his premonitions, so he tries to stay away from everyone. But then he realizes that a politician will bring World War III to happen, so John needs to decide what to do in order to stop that from happening. While that pretty much tells the most important parts of the book, there are two smaller stories that are also interesting. The first one became the basis of the TV series, as John helps the sheriff of a small Maine town called Castle Rock to catch a serial killer, and as the series had Johnny solving cases every week. While the second is a bit of a callback, as one of John's prophecies is a prom dance that will end in a terrible fire, and he needs to save the kids from it. Except that later, some people decide that he must have started the fire, like that Carrie girl from that book. Those two events are the bulk of the book, far more important than Greg Stilson, the politician, who only meets with Johnny once in the whole story. But as they aren't as flashy as World War III, they tend to be brushed off when one summarizes the book. Because of how the book was written, from the moment Johnny had his accident, recounting the years and what is going on as he sleeps, we have to follow Greg Stilson go from a Bible salesman to a county's mayor, and his plans to go even further, as well as Johnny's would-have-been girlfriends and Johnny's parents and their sorrow as the years pass, and even the killer in Castle Rock as he starts his path of darkness, even if we don't know his identity. The novel at times may seem a bit slow if we know the plot, be it by the movie, the series, or pop culture osmosis, because we don't get to, oh yes, Greg Stilson is going to cause World War III until far, far into it. But it's that slow pace what helps us to realize the full horror of Johnny's situation. It is not just his power, even if those allow him to witness some really horrible things that people do and will do, but also how, as his life was put on standby due to his injuries and his coma, his family and loved ones can't move on. And they need to, in order to keep going forward. It is the sadness of knowing a person that we love is gone, but at the same time not knowing or not believing that person is gone, and having some hope that they might return. Something that, in fact, also waits in Johnny's mind once he wakes up. And of course, there are the mothers. The main topic I wanted to touch, even if at first glance from the synopsis, any mother in the dead zone is a secondary character. But again, thanks to the narration, even if one of the mothers is only mentioned in flashbacks, we get to know them very well. Those mothers are Vera Smith, Mary Lou Stilson, and Henrietta Dodds. And they form a very interesting triangle on how the motherly figure appears in King's works. So let's start with Vera Smith, Johnny's mother. She holds a very special place among King's characters, as she is the one extreme religious fanatic who is not a villain. She's not the only religious character that is good. We are going to meet some more than a few in the future of almost every denomination. But the others never reach the levels of religious fervor that Vera and other villainous fanatics achieve. We're talking Margaret White's level of delusions. And yet, she's firmly in the side of the good guys, all the way up until her death. We first met her through Johnny's words, as he tells about her to Sarah, his girlfriend, before the accident. Johnny wants Sarah to meet his parents, but he warns him that Vera is a little too religious compared to his dad, Herb, and Johnny himself, who is mostly agnostic, if not outright atheist. He mentions that when he goes to visit, she will put tracts on his back and try to make him go to church with him. Eccentric? Yes. And if the tracts in question are chick tracts, those nasty little comics where everyone is going to hell, a bit problematic. But nothing that will make us fear Vera. Then the accident happens, and we first see her in person. As Herb is trying to figure out what happened to their son, in which hospital, and how are they going to deal, Vera goes to her knees and starts screeching her prayers, loud enough that Herb has to yell at her to shut up so he can hear the cop over the phone. That's when we realize that maybe Johnny didn't know how bad his mom had gotten, and we still don't know how bad she would get. In the course of Johnny's coma, Vera goes from slightly eccentric to joining at least 3 different cults, only to be stopped from doing some drastic things like selling their house by Herb, live to wait for an UFO to take her and others to heaven, mirroring what will happen much later in the tragedy of Heaven's Gate, decide that heaven is not in outer space but in Antarctica, try to move to a commune there to wait for the end of the world, and grow more and more convinced that the reason why Johnny was in an accident was to punish her and her husband for her husband's lack of faith. Things don't get better when Johnny wakes. As then Vera, who by that point was the only one who still believed he would wake up, decides that her son was chosen by God to fulfill a special mission. When she sees Johnny's powers on TV during an interview, she suffers a heart attack, probably brought by her hypertension, diabetes, and overweight. But Johnny feels very guilty about the timing, and dies, not without telling him that his power is something wonderful, and that he shouldn't hide and try to escape from God's will. Vera is a tragic portrait of many, many people who are conned by their own fate. Without getting into a theological argument, I think that we can all agree that those who claim they can heal a comatose man by special prayer and water from a miracle fountain for only $20 plus shipping and handling are conmen who are preying on the weak. In the case of Vera, yes, she was starting that path before the novel begins, but it's the apparent loss of her only child what makes her snap. Herb, a man of his time, tries to help her but is unable to. At one point, he figures that it was his own fault for not stepping in earlier, before Vera left a proper church, so to speak, and started reading cheap magazines about finding God in tomatoes and tortillas. The novel doesn't go deep into this, but for about a quarter of its length, we can't but feel sorry for Vera, because despite her fate-induced madness, despite her anger at Herb, at Johnny, and at everyone who calls her crazy, in the end she loves her son and wants nothing but the best for him. She loves Johnny and she knows he has a mission. At the time of her death, she knows nothing of Greg Stilson. Johnny himself won't meet the man until years later. But she knows her son is special and that she would do anything for him. The question we are left with is, would she let him murder someone if that was his mission from God? Or would she try to help him find a different way, since she also knows that murder is sin? This brings us to Henrietta Dodds, widower and mother of Frank Dodds. There are not many words to describe how horribly abusive Henrietta is, or how much she managed to destroy her son's life before he turned 18. Importantly, unlike Vera, we only see Henrietta in about 4 pages. The rest of the information we have on her are due to one flashback from Frank at the beginning of the novel, which later Johnny has to relive as a vision, and by Sheriff Bannerman explanations of Frank's life as to why he can't be a rapist murderer as he takes care of his sick mother. Thus, we have nothing that would make Henrietta a little bit sympathetic, since ever her illness is presented as a reason why she never let her baby become independent from her. She is the devouring mother, the beloved smotherer, except she also tortured her son to make sure he'd never leave her for a nasty fucker. And to make clear to him that sex was wrong, she put a clothespin on his genitals when she caught him having an erection when he was 9. But that is not what makes Henrietta Dodds horrible, or such a big example of motherly love gone wrong. No, nor the fact that her very first appearance makes Margaret White look calm and collected. What makes Henrietta Dodds such a memorable character is that for 5 years she knew that her son was a serial killer, that he would rape and kill women of all ages, including a 9-year-old child, and she said nothing. And when the sheriff, practically forced by Johnny, finally goes to arrest Frank, Henrietta keeps defending her son, trying to buy him time. We never know if she knew that he had killed himself, as she tried to make sure Bannerman and Smith didn't enter the house, nor the room of her baby that was still decorated as if he was 9 rather than a grown man. But we can never forget the horrified enunciated, "You knew," that came from Johnny as he brushed her arm. If she loved Frank honestly and that love got twisted on the way, we can't really know. Was she afraid of being alone and that's why she never said a thing? Or was she driven by the need to keep her boy safe? It's a terrible question we have to ask. What would a mother do if she knew her child was a monster? But in the case of Henrietta, we know that she could turn a blind eye to at least 6 murders. The question is, could she have stayed quiet if she knew of more? And this brings us, somewhat, to Mary Lou Stilson, the only mother of the trio that we only know by literal hearsay, as we never once get a real flashback of her, except for Greg remembering she always told him that he was special, that he would go on to do big things. We know that, just as Henrietta, she lost her husband to a terrible accident and was left to raise Greg alone. Although Greg was a bit older than Frank when his father died, we know that she loved her son and would never believe he was guilty of anything, no matter how much proof the schools where Greg attended had, and thus, thanks to her, Greg never faced the consequences of his action. That she benefited directly from her son's first job as a rainmaker, but not what she thought of it, or if she knew about the shadier parts of her son's doing. She even died before Greg started his path selling Bibles, so we don't even know what she thought of that, or of the other pamphlets he sold that were full of hateful rhetoric. The information we have of Mary Lou is so little, you may be wondering why I bothered to include her on the list. Why not just leave it between Vera and Henrietta? Well, it's because we know the most important part, that just like Vera and Henrietta, she loved her Greg. And it's that love what made the final confrontation between Greg and Johnny inevitable, just like Henrietta's twisted love made Frank into a killer. So we have 3 mothers, with a somewhat twisted form of love that mirror each other in some ways. But Henrietta and Mary Lou lost their husbands, all 3 of them only had 1 son, and if we are going to judge Vera's reaction to finding that Johnny had a girlfriend he never mentioned to her, and make some assumptions at the fact that Greg never married nor had any children, we can venture that none of them were quick to loosen their apron strings, even if only Henrietta took the desire to keep her baby with her to horrible length. All of them are sure that their children are special, and must not be soiled by the real world in any way. Sure, Vera didn't seem to act that way in her younger years, but she's the only one who had a good husband who didn't beat her, didn't drink, and didn't go and get himself killed. No, I am not saying that King has something against single women, which could be inferred given how Margaret White was also a widower. In fact, he also has horrible mothers that are still married by the time the horrors start, and we know how much he loved and respected his own mother. But he's giving some thoughts to a situation where love can get stagnant and rotten when there are no other outlets, or there are external situations that can add resentment to the mix. Remember, in the 60s and 70s, single mothers of young children had little chance to be respected by their neighbors, and much less to get good jobs or new husbands. There's the fact that the more we know about the mother in question, the less deadly the son happens to be. And yes, they also only have sons, no daughters in the dead zone. We know next to nothing about Mary Lou Stilson. Her name is only mentioned once in the whole novel, and yet Greg is what we'd call the big bad who, if left unchecked, would end the world in a nuclear war out of his own misplaced pride and growing insanity, nothing to do with what is currently going on in the world. Yes, in the middle ground, we have Henrietta Dodds, and will we know more about her? We only learn what we do from others thinking about her, not from her directly, and her son is a serial killer with at least 6 victims under his belt. And then there's Vera, who we get to know quite well, and we follow through her fall into fundamentalistic madness. We get to understand her fears, her love for Johnny, why she became so stubborn in her beliefs, and why she needed her suffering to mean something. And of course, Johnny is the one son who doesn't kill anyone, and even when he tried to, his victim was just one man who we can all agree that completely deserved it, especially at how everything ended, and I promised that I was not going to talk about that. Which ties very nicely with the purpose that King had when he started writing the book. Can you humanize a sniper who is planning to kill a politician? Later on can we worry about the should you humanize a sniper, and since the publication of The Dead Zone, there have been other works that directly try to humanize Lee Oswald, John F. Kennedy killer, and the inspiration for this book. As an aside, I'd recommend the manga Billy Bat by Naoki Urasawa as a great example of how this can be done. But the answer is simple. Make us care for them. And how better to care for a person than letting us know their loved ones, in particular, their mom. After all, as Johnny thinks at some point, even bad boys love their mamas. The Dead Zone is one of the most interesting early Stephen King's novels, and not just because it's the one he plotted completely from the original idea of what if Lee Harvey Oswald was the hero of the story, to the end result before starting to write, instead of his usual style of having an idea and just start writing, seeing where it gets him. We can see the end result of some of the narrative seeds planted in previous books, like the great use of smaller snippets of news and books, especially at the end, the use of foreshadowing of certain events that might kill the suspense but help to create a more solid sense of tragedy, and of course, the way in which each character has a role to play, which depends a lot on their position in life. It is also the first novel where we don't have at least one character dedicated to the art, like a painter, a writer, or even a comic book artist. And yes, this is a thing I believe we should put a pin on for future consideration. Meanwhile, I hope that I made a good point for you about the mothers, and how King uses the relationship of his characters to their mothers to give us a bigger scope of their personalities, from the caring to the horribly narcissistic. Again, something to have in mind while we see other parental relationships in future books, and later, when watching the TV series where, for instance, they killed Vera long before Johnny woke up, and instead showed us a more calm mother in the form of Sarah Batterman. I want to thank my dear patrons, Kaiser Carranza, Mitch Hyman, and Elaine Ho, as well as my first supporter, Tania Pineda. I also want to remind you that if you want to support these and my other projects, and get your name mentioned here, you can do so at patreon.com/Adalisa, written link on description, as I know my name can be hard to spell. And with just $1 a month, you will be always thanked in my videos, as well as get access to a ton of art and other stuff before anyone else. If you can't support me this way, I also accept likes, subscriptions to the channel, comments so that the algorithm catches engagement, and of course, you sharing the links. I will also welcome all your questions, comments, and suggestions in the comments below. And I hope to see you next month when we leave the darkness of the Dead Zone for the bright light that comes from a little girl in Firestarter.